You used words like embracing, building, expanding. Those are verbs. So it
Yeah.
sounds like someone or maybe a team at some point realized, hey, this is our culture. In order to get not only products and services, but also these byproducts, as you mentioned, we should have a different culture.
Yeah.
And there's an A to B. So basically, that's my next question. What is the process, the approach from getting from A to B and building, embracing, expanding this culture?
It's a great question, and I think the reality is it's different for every organization. Every culture by default. If we look at cultures around the world, every culture in the world is different. Some demonstrably different, and then some slightly different. The reality is every organization and its culture is unique. So its starting point and the journey that it needs to go on, for some organizations can be quite short and simple, and for other organizations can be long and complex. But I have a certain framework, if you like, which is what the book was based on, which I think lays out a certain framework and certain steps. And it's not unlike people in the HR world will know of Kotter's 8-step process and GE's CAP or change acceleration process. These are well-known methods for changing organizations. So every organization needs to transition, and I think that word's important. I don't think it's about change anymore. I think it's about transitioning from one mode or one state to another. But there are certain fundamentals that transition needs. The first is really clear strategy that underpins why that transition is required and what the pace, what the time frame of that transition is and what the extent of that transition is. And when organizations build that and they're really clear on that strategic imperative to change or to transition, the next thing I think that's really important is real, genuine leadership alignment and understanding of why and specifically how to make that transition. Where I've seen a lot of change in these transformation programs fail, it's because those two core things haven't been done well enough. There's real strategic clarity on how to change and real understanding and capability by the senior leadership and management teams, again, on how to make that change. And if you don't have both of those, it tends not to stick. And then there's, the next thing is how well we communicate that process and how well we engage all our people in that transition. So 3 things for me are strategy, leadership, and then how we embed it into culture. And there's lots of more deeper, sort of more granular detail to that, but those are the 3 core components I think are important.
Of course, I will want to hear more of these details, but before we go into that, it sounds like it's a top-down thing versus a bottom-up thing. Is that correct?
I actually think it's a third one. I think it's driven by leaders. It's driven by a strategic imperative to shift the organization to a different mode or a different place. I actually think innovation's about being not necessarily top down or bottom up. I think it's about middle out. I think for me, the unsung heroes and the gatekeepers to innovation in most organizations are that middle management layer. And I think unjustly, we hear lots of language about them being referred to as the permafrost. My challenge is, I think, who creates that permafrost? So I use language like, if the middle managers are the permafrost, then leaders are the cold north wind, right? Middle managers aren't behaving in a certain way because they want to. They're behaving in a certain way because they're made to, and they're pressured into doing certain things by leadership teams. So getting that leadership understanding of how to transition is important. And then the real key, the absolute key, is enabling people in the middle of the organization to drive that transition and drive the behavior that innovation requires. So I think it's about being middle out, not top down or bottom up.
Makes perfect sense. How do you enable middle management then? What are tools and techniques for doing that?
So I think one of the first things is, and this tends to be where the big challenge for organizations is, that middle management layer are the ones most under pressure to deliver the day-to-day. They're the ones who are structurally in a position where the output of that business, delivering certain numbers or hitting certain targets, etc. They're the ones that are hands-on in a specific role to do that. So the challenge is when we then give them this extra challenge of, but we want you to deliver and drive innovation across the business. We then say in the same hand, or the traditional approach is, oh, but don't forget to hit your targets by the end of the week. So the first thing with middle managers to really enable them is leaders need to reframe what they want middle managers to do. We've got to completely reframe whether we want them to focus on hitting their monthly targets at the end of the month, or whether we want them to focus on the different things that we genuinely believe will add value over the long term to the organization. So the key thing is removing those barriers that stop them doing things different, trying new things, challenging the status quo. I think it's about removing those barriers, not necessarily about giving them loads and loads of new tools and techniques. I think most managers and most people, from what I see, perfectly able and want to do different things, creative things. Of course, we can enable them further, but I think the biggest shift in the needle is removing the barriers that stop them doing that already.
And is that also where it sometimes, or maybe often still goes wrong in a way that, yes, leadership communicates and talks about innovation, but in the day-to-day, they still expect you as a middle management or innovation manager to deliver upon the traditional metrics and objectives and all of that stuff?
Yeah, and I think those traditional metrics, the reality is, the majority of businesses are still under pressure to keep driving their business, to keep hitting their numbers, right? To survive. The really enlightened ones know that is only going to allow them to survive for the short term. That the transition they need to make to be a much more innovation-led organization, might be a painful hump that they need to get over, but the long-term benefits of building that capability far outweigh the short-term pain that they might have to go through. But it takes a brave CEO and a brave leadership team to start that journey, because it is painful in the short term.
I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with someone. We basically said, we were going downhill, that at some point the leadership said, well, just do whatever you think is good for the business. And magically all these things started to appear, and hey, the company is back on track. So it's, of course, there's more to the story than what I'm now sharing, but it sounds like indeed maybe that's a better approach. But then the question is, are we in trouble enough to realize it and to let go of that traditional control and command?
And I think for what I see globally is, we are still in a conversational mode around innovation. There's still a lot of rhetoric, and there's still a lot of talk. There's a movement for a lot of organizations to start taking innovation seriously. But on the most part, most organizations are still paying lip service to it, because I don't think they're not actually feeling the pain and the effects of the world that we live in. And the challenge is, people like you and I can keep reinforcing the fact that at some point that pain is going to start to you're going to be aware of that pain. The challenge is that then too late to start to shift and transition and do something about it? And I think we've seen and felt the lessons of global brands all over the world who've left it too late. And I think the next really big shift is the next Generation Z, that everyone's talking about, and making the transition to put innovation at the center of an organization and put those people at the center. That's what Generation Z are already, all the research and all the reports tell us that's what they're going to want. and I don't see enough organizations making the transition towards them. And that, I think, is going to be, that is almost going to be the next, if you like, the next crash, if you like. That's going to be the next big catalyst for a few organizations falling by the wayside, because they're going to lose out on that war on talent. They're not going to be able to attract the really clever, creative, entrepreneurial people. And I think it's going to be a really, really interesting time for innovation over the next few years.
Sounds exciting, at least if you're on the good side of history. Just one more question to round up this part of the conversation. I understand ideally you have this leadership setting the strategy and communicating about it, but what if you're part of an organization that doesn't really care, probably doesn't really feel the pain, but you as an innovation manager or whatever, you're heading up the lab or you're heading up the innovation team, you do want to do something to at least create these ripples that might lead to this bigger thing of culture of innovation. So what are the maybe smaller things that I as an innovation manager can do to at least implement or instill some of these mindset and habits?
So the first thing is, are you as that innovation manager, are you brave enough to be a bit subversive, right? Are you brave enough to do things under the radar? Are you brave enough to take a bit of risk and try new things, knowing, like we all are as really innovation-led people, we all know that innovation will pay dividends in the end, but sometimes we've got to do things under the radar to prove that, right? So the first challenge is, if you are that kind of innovation manager, then you've just got to start doing stuff under the radar. You've got to absolutely believe that innovation will deliver great things, and you've got to choose small projects, small challenges, and get as many people as you can on board. And if you can get a few, there will always be a few seniors that are willing to let you try stuff or back you, on the quiet. You've got to find those people, and you've just got to, in a guerrilla fashion, you've just got to start doing things under the radar. Because what senior team and what senior leaders want is, they just want proof that something is going to work, right? If you can prove time and time again, however small, that a process, that a way of thinking, that a methodology, that an approach genuinely works and it adds value to the business, the more you can do that, the easier it becomes for that senior team to say, okay, let's start listening to these guys, because there's some stock in what they're talking about. But you've just got to be brave, and you've just got to believe that design thinking, creativity, all those things genuinely works.